Chapter 1 of the Gifts of the Child Christ. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Gifts of the Child Christ by George Macdonald. Chapter 1. My hearers, we grow old, said the preacher. Be it summer or be it spring with us now, autumn will soon settle down into winter, that winter whose snow melts only in the grave. The wind of the world sets for the tomb. Some of us rejoice to be swept along on its swift wings, and hear it bellowing in the hollows of earth and sky. But it will grow a terror to the man of trembling limb and withered brain, until at length he will long for the shelter of the tomb to escape its roaring and buffeting. Happy the man who shall then be able to believe that old age itself, with its pitiable decays and sad dreams of youth, is the chastening of the Lord, a sure sign of his love and his fatherhood. It was the first Sunday in Advent, but the chastening of the Lord came into almost every sermon that man preached. Eloquent! But after all, can this kind of thing be true? Said to himself a man of about 30, who sat decorously listening. For many years he had thought he believed this kind of thing, but of late he was not so sure. Beside him sat his wife, in her new winter bonnet, her pretty face turned up toward the preacher, but her eyes, nothing else, revealed that she was not listening. She was much younger than her husband. Hardly 20, indeed. In the upper corner of the pew sat a pale-faced child about 5, sucking her thumb and staring at the preacher. The sermon over, they walked home in proximity. The husband looked gloomy, and his eyes sought the ground. The wife looked more smiling than cheerful, and her pretty eyes went hither and thither. Behind them walked the child, steadily, with level fronting eyelids. It was a late-built region of large, commonplace houses, and at one of them they stopped and entered. The door of the dining-room was open, showing the table laid for their Sunday dinner. The gentleman passed on to the library behind it. The lady went up to her bedroom, and the child a stage higher to the nursery. It wanted half an hour to dinner. Mr. Greatorex sat down, drummed with his fingers on the arm of his easy chair, took up a book of Arctic exploration, threw it again on the table, got up, and went to the smoking room. He had built it for his wife's sake, but was often glad of it for his own. Again he seated himself, took a cigar, and smoked gloomily. Having reached her bedroom, Mrs. Greatorex took off her bonnet, and stood for 10 minutes turning it round and round. Earnestly she regarded it, now gave a twist to the wire stem of a flower, then spread wider the loop of a bow. She was meditating what it lacked of perfection, rather than brooding over its merits. She was keen in bonnets. Little Sophie, or as she called herself by a transposition of consonant sounds common with children, Phosie, found her nurse Alice in the nursery. But she was lost in the pages of a certain London weekly, which had found her in a mood open to its influences, and did not even look up when the child entered. With some effort Phosie drew off her gloves, and with more difficulty untied her hat. Then she took off her jacket, smoothed her hair, and retreated to a corner. There a large shabby doll lay upon her little chair. She took it up, disposed it gently upon the bed, seated herself in its place, got a little book from where she had left it under the chair, smoothed down her skirts, and began simultaneously to read and suck her thumb. The book was an unhealthy one, a cup filled to the brim with a poverty-stricken and selfish religion. Such are always breaking out like an eruption here and there over the body of the Church, doing their part, doubtless, in carrying off the evil humours generated by poverty of blood or the congestion of self-preservation. It is wonderful out of what spoiled fruit some children will suck sweetness. But she did not read far. Her thoughts went back to a phrase which had haunted her ever since she first went to church. Whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. I wish he would chasten me, she thought for the 100th time. The small Christian had no suspicion that her whole life had been a period of chastening, that few children, indeed, had to live in such a sunless atmosphere as hers. Alice threw down the newspaper, gazed from the window into the backyard of the next house, saw nothing but an elderly man-servant brushing a garment, and turned upon Sophie. "Why don't you hang up your jacket, miss?" she said sharply. The little one rose, opened the wardrobe door wide, carried a chair to it, fetched her jacket from the bed, clambered up on the chair, and, leaning far forward to reach a peg, tumbled right into the bottom of the wardrobe. "You clumsy!" exclaimed the nurse angrily, and pulling her out by the arm, shook her. Alice was not generally rough to her, but there were reasons today. Phosy crept back to her seat, pale, frightened, and a little hurt. Alice hung up the jacket, closed the wardrobe, and turning, contemplated her own pretty face and neat figure in the glass opposite. The dinner bell rang. "There, I declare!" she cried, and wheeled round on Phosy. "And your hair is not brushed yet, miss! Will you ever learn to do a thing without being told it? Thank goodness I shan't be plagued with you long, but I pity her as comes after me, I do." "If the Lord would but chasten me," said the child to herself, as she rose and laid down her book with a sigh. The maid seized her roughly by the arm, and brushed her hair with an angry haste that made the child's eyes water, and herself feel a little ashamed at the sight of them. "How could anybody love such a troublesome chit?" she said, seeking the comfort of justification from the child herself. Another sigh was the poor little damsel's only answer. She looked very white and solemn as she entered the dining-room. Mr. Greatorex was a merchant in the city, but he was much more of a man than a merchant, which all merchants are not. Also he was more scrupulous in his dealings than some merchants in the same line of business, who yet stood as well with the world as he, but, on the other hand, he had the meanness to pride himself upon it, as if it had been something he might have done without and yet held up his head. Some 6 years before he had married to please his parents, and a year before he had married to please himself. His first wife had intellect, education, and heart, but little individuality, not enough to reflect the individuality of her husband. The consequence was he found her uninteresting. He was kind and indulgent, however, and not even her best friend blamed him much for manifesting nothing beyond the average devotion of husbands. But in truth his wife had great capabilities, only they had never ripened, and when she died, a fortnight after giving birth to Sophie, her husband had not a suspicion of the large amount of undeveloped power that had passed away with her. Her child was so like her both in countenance and manner that he was too constantly reminded of her unlamented mother, and he loved neither enough to discover that, in a sense as true as marvellous, the child was the very flower bud of her mother's nature, in which her retarded blossom had yet a chance of being slowly carried to perfection. Love alone gives insight, and the father took her merely for a miniature edition of the volume which he seemed to have laid aside for ever in the dust of the earth's slumber-room. Instead, therefore, of watering the roots of his little human slip from the well of his affections, he had scarcely as yet perceived more in relation to her than that he was legally accountable for her existence, and bound to give her shelter and food. If he had questioned himself on the matter, he would have replied that love was not wanting, only waiting upon her growth and the development of something to interest him. Little right as he had had to expect anything from his first marriage, he had yet cherished some hopes therein, tolerably vague, it is true, yet hardly faint enough, it would seem, for he was disappointed in them. When its bonds fell from him, however, he flattered himself that he had not warned them in vain, but had through them arrived at a knowledge of women as rare as profound. But whatever the reach of this knowledge, it was not sufficient to prevent him from harboring the presumptuous hope of so choosing and so fashioning the heart and mind of a woman that they should be as concave mirrors to his own. I do not mean that he would have admitted the figure, but such was really the end he blindly sought. I wonder how many of those who have been disappointed in such an attempt have been thereby aroused to the perception of what a frightful failure their success would have been on both sides. It was bad enough that Augustus Greatorex's theories had cramped his own development. It would have been tenfold worse had they been operative to the stunting of another soul. Letty Merriweather was the daughter of a bishop in partibus. She had been born tolerably innocent, had grown up more than tolerably pretty, and was, when she came to England at the age of 16, as nearly a genuine example of Locke's sheet of a white paper as could well have fallen to the hand of such an experimenter as Greatorex would fain become. In his suit he had prospered, perhaps too easily. He loved the girl, or at least loved the modified reflection of her in his own mind, while she, thoroughly admiring the dignity, good looks, and accomplishments of the man whose attentions flattered her self-opinion, accorded him deference enough to encourage his vainest hopes. Although she knew little, fluttering over the merest surfaces of existence, she had sense enough to know that he talked sense to her, and foolishness enough to put it down to her own credit, while for the sense itself she cared little or nothing. And Greatorex, without even knowing what she was rough-hewn for, would take upon him to shape her ends, and ambition the divinity never permits to succeed. He who fancies himself the carver finds himself but the chisel, or indeed perhaps only the mallet, in the hand of the true workman. During the days of his courtship, then, Letty listened and smiled, or answered with what he took for a spiritual response, when it was merely a brain echo, looking down into the pond of her being, whose surface was not yet rippled by a bubbling of springs from below. He saw the reflection of himself and was satisfied. An able man on his hobby looks a centaur of wisdom and folly. But if he be at all a wise man, the beast will one day or other show him the jade's favor of unseating him. Meantime, Augustus Greatorex was fooled, not by poor little Letty, who was not capable of fooling him, but by himself. Letty had made no pretenses, had been interested, and had shown her interest, had understood, or seemed to understand, what he said to her, and forgotten it the next moment, had no pocket to put it in, did not know what to do with it, and let it drop into the limbo of vanity. They had not been married many days before the scouts of advancing disappointment were upon them. Augustus resisted manfully for a time, but the truth was, each of the two had to become a great deal more than either was before any approach to unity was possible. He tried to interest her in one subject after another, tried her first, I am ashamed to say, with political economy. In that instance, when he came home to dinner, he found that she had not got beyond the first page of the book he had left her. But she had the best of excuses, namely, that of that page she had not understood a sentence. He saw his mistake, and tried her with poetry. But Milton, with whom unfortunately he commenced his approaches, was to her, if not equally unintelligible, equally uninteresting. He tried her next with the elements of science, but with no better success. He returned to poetry, and read some of the Faerie Queene with her. She was, or seemed to be, interested in all his talk about it, and inclined to go on with it in his absence, but found the first stanza she tried more than enough without him to give life to it. She could give it none, and therefore it gave her none. I believe she read a chapter of the Bible every day, but the only books she read with any real interest were novels of a sort that Augustus despised. It never occurred to him that he ought at once to have made friends of this Momus of unrighteousness, for by them he might have found entrance to the sealed chamber. He ought to have read with her the books she liked, for by them only could he make her think, and from them alone could he lead her to better. It is but from the very step upon which one stands that one can move to the next. Besides these books, there was nothing in her scheme of the universe but fashion, dress, calls, the park, other peopledom, concerts, plays, church-going. Whatever could show itself on the frosted glass of her camera obscura, make an interest of motion and color in her darkened chamber. Without these, her bosom's mistress would have found life unendurable, for not yet had she ascended her throne, but lay on the floor of her nursery, surrounded with toys that imitated life. No wonder, therefore, that Augustus was at length compelled to allow himself disappointment. That it was the fault of his self-confidence made the thing no whit better. He was too much of a man to not cherish a certain tenderness for her, but he soon found to his dismay that it had begun to be mingled with a shadow of contempt. Against this he struggled, but with fluctuating success. He stopped later and later at business, and when he came home spent more and more of his time in the smoking room, where by and by he had bookshelves put up. Occasionally he would accept an invitation to dinner and accompany his wife, but he detested evening parties, and when Letty, who never refused an invitation if she could help it, went to one, he remained at home with his books. But his power of reading began to diminish. He became restless and irritable. Something kept gnawing at his heart. There was a sore spot in it. The spot grew larger and larger, and by degrees the center of his consciousness came to be a soreness. His cherished idea had been fooled. He had taken a silly girl for a woman of undeveloped wealth, a bubble, a surface whereon fair colors chased each other, for a hearted crystal. On her part, Letty too had a grief, which, unlike Augustus, she did not keep to herself, receiving in return from more than one of her friends the soothing assurance that Augustus was only like all other men, that women were but their toys, which they cast away when weary of them. Letty did not see that she was herself making a toy of her life, or that Augustus was right in refusing to play with such a costly and delicate thing. Neither did Augustus see that, having by his own blunder married a mere child, he was bound to deal with her as one, and not let the child suffer for his fault more than what could not be helped. It is not by pressing our insights upon them, but by bathing the sealed eyelids of the human kittens, that we can help them. And all the time poor little Phosy was left to the care of Alice, a clever, careless, good-hearted, self-satisfied damsel, who, although seldom so rough in her behavior as we have just seen her, abandoned the child almost entirely to her own resources. It was often she sat alone in the nursery, wishing the Lord would chasten her, because then he would love her. The first course was nearly over ere Augustus had brought himself to ask, "What did you think of the sermon today, Letty?" "Not much," answered Letty. "I am not fond of finery. I prefer simplicity." Augustus held his peace bitterly, for it was just finery in a sermon, without knowing it, that Letty was fond of. What seemed to him a flimsy syllabub of sacred things, beaten up with a whisk of composition, was charming to Letty, while on the contrary, if a man such as they had been listening to what was carried away by the thoughts that struggled in him for utterance, the result, to her judgment, was finery, and the object display. In excuse, it must be remembered that she had been used to her father's style, which no one could have aspired with lack of sobriety. Presently she spoke again. "Gus, dear, could you make up your mind for once to go with me to Lady Ashdale's to-morrow? I am getting quite ashamed of appearing so often without you." "There is another way of avoiding that unpleasantness," remarked her husband dryly. "You cruel creature," returned Letty playfully. "But I must go this once, for I promised Mrs. Holden." "You know, Letty," said her husband, after a little pause, "it gets of more and more consequence that you should not fatigue yourself. By keeping such late hours in such stifling rooms you are endangering two lives. Remember that, Letty. If you stay at home tomorrow, I will come home early and read to you all evening." "Gussie, that would be charming. You know there is nothing in the world I should enjoy so much. But this time I really mustn't." She launched into a list of all the great nobodies and small somebodies who were to be there, and whom she positively must see. It might be her only chance. Those last words quenched a sarcasm on Augustus's lips. He was kinder than usual the rest of the evening, and read her to sleep with the Pilgrim's Progress. Phosy sat in a corner, listened and understood, or where she misunderstood, it was an honest misunderstanding, which never does much hurt. Neither father nor mother spoke to her till they bade her good night. Neither saw the hungry heart under the mask of the still face. The father never imagined her already fit for the modelling. She was better without, and the stepmother had to become a mother before she could value her. Phosy went to bed to dream of the valley of humiliation. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Gifts of the Child Christ by George Macdonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. The next morning Alice gave her mistress warning. It was quite unexpected, and she looked at her aghast. "Alice," she said at length, "you're never going to leave me at such a time." "I'm sorry it don't suit you, ma'am, but I must." "Why, Alice? What is the matter? Has Sophie been troublesome?" "No, ma'am. There's no harm in that child." "Then what can it be, Alice? Perhaps you are going to be married sooner than you expected?" Alice gave her chin a little toss, pressed her lips together, and was silent. "I have always been kind to you," resumed her mistress. "I'm sure, ma'am, I never made no complaints," returned Alice, but as she spoke she drew herself up straighter than before. "Then what is it?" said her mistress. "The fact is, ma'am," answered the girl almost fiercely, "I cannot any longer endure a state of domestic slavery." "I don't understand you a bit better," said Mrs. Greatorex, trying, but in vain, to smile, and therefore looking angrier than she was. "I mean, ma'am, and I see no reason as I shouldn't say it, for it's the truth, there's a worm at the root of society, where one human being's got to do the dirty work of another. I don't mind sweeping up my own dust, but I won't sweep up nobody else's. I ain't going to demean myself no longer. There." "Leave the room, Alice," said Mrs. Greatorex, and when, with a toss and a flounce, the young woman had vanished, she burst into tears of anger and annoyance. The day passed. The evening came. She dressed without Alice's usual help, and went to Mrs. Ashdale's with a friend. There a reaction took place, and her spirits rose unnaturally. She even danced, to the disgust of one or two quick-eyed matrons who sat by the wall. When she came home she found her husband sitting up for her. He said next to nothing, and sat up an hour longer with his book. In the night she was taken ill. Her husband called Alice, and ran himself to fetch the doctor. For some hours she seemed in danger, but by noon was much better. Only the greatest care was necessary. As soon as she could speak, she told Augustus of Alice's warning, and he sent for her to the library. She stood before him with flushed cheeks and flashing eyes. "I understand, Alice, you have given your mistress warning," he said gently. "Yes, sir." "Your mistress is very ill, Alice." "Yes, sir." Don't you think it would be ungrateful of you to leave her in her present condition? She's not likely to be strong for some time to come." The use of the word ungrateful was an unfortunate one. Alice begged to know what she had to be grateful for. Was her work worth nothing? And her master, as everyone must who claims that which can only be freely given, found himself in the wrong. "Well, Alice," he said, "we won't dispute that point, and if you are really determined on going, you must do the best you can for your mistress for the rest of the month." Alice's sense of injury was soothed by her master's forbearance. She had always rather approved of Mr. Greatorex, and she left the room more softly than she had entered it. Letty had a fortnight in bed, during which she reflected a little. The very day on which she left her room, Alice sought an interview with her master, and declared that she could not stay out her month. She must go home at once. She had been very attentive to her mistress during the fortnight. There must be something to account for her strange behaviour. "Come now, Alice," said her master, "what's at the back of all this? You have been a good, well-behaved, obliging girl till now, and I am certain you would never be like this if there weren't something wrong somewhere." "Something wrong, sir? No, indeed, sir, except you call it wrong to have an old uncle's dies and leaves ever so much money, thousands on thousands, the lawyers say." "And does it come to you then, Alice?" "I get my share, sir. He left it to be parted even between his nephews and nieces." "Why, Alice, you are quite an heiress then," returned her master, scarcely however believing the thing so grand as Alice would have it. "But don't you think now it would be rather hard that your fortune should be Mrs. Greatorex's misfortune?" "Well, I don't see how it shouldn't," replied Alice. "It's Mrs.'s fortune as has been my misfortune. Ain't it now, sir? And why shouldn't it be the other way next?" "I don't quite see how your mistress's fortune can be said to be your misfortune, Alice." "Anybody would see that, sir, as wasn't blinded by class prejudices." "Class prejudices!" exclaimed Mr. Greatorex, in surprise at the word. "It's a term they use, I believe, sir, but it's plain enough that if Mrs. hadn't been better off than me, she wouldn't have been able to secure my services, as you calls it." "That is certainly plain enough," returned Mr. Greatorex. "But suppose nobody had been able to secure your services, what would have become of you?" "By that time the people rose up to assert their rights." "To what? To fortunes like yours?" "To bread and cheese at least, sir," returned Alice pertly. "Well, but you've had something better than bread and cheese." "I don't make no complaints as to the style of living in the house, sir, but that's all one, so long as it's on the vile condition of domestic slavery, which it's nothing can justify." "Then, of course, although you are now a woman of property, you will never dream of having anyone to wait on you," said her master, amused with the volume of human nature thus opened to him. "All I say, sir, is, it's my turn now, and I ain't going to be sit upon by no one. I know my duty to myself." "I didn't know there was any such duty, Alice," said her master. Something in his tone displeased her. "Then you know now, sir," she said, and bounced out of the room. The next moment, however, ashamed of her rudeness, she re-entered, saying, "I don't mean to be unkind, sir, but I must go home. I've got a brother that's ill too, and wants to see me. If you don't object to me going home for a month, I promise you to come back and see Mrs. through her trouble, as a friend, you know, sir." "But just listen to me first, Alice," said Mr. Greatorex. "I've had something to do with wills in my time, and I can assure you it is not likely to be less than a year before you can touch the money. You had better stay where you are till your uncle's affairs are settled. You don't know what may happen. There's many a slip between cup and lip, you know." "Oh, it's all right, sir. Everybody knows the money's left to his nephews and nieces, and me and my brother's as good as any." I don't doubt it. Still, if you'll take my advice, you'll keep a sound roof over your head till another's ready for you." Alice only threw her chin in the air and almost said threateningly, "Am I to go for a month, sir?" "I'll talk to your mistress about it," answered Mr. Greatorex, not at all sure that such an arrangement would be for his wife's comfort. But the next day Mrs. Greatorex had a long talk with Alice, and the result was that on the following Monday she was to go home for a month, and then return for 2 months more at least. What Mr. Greatorex had said about the legacy had had its effect, and besides, her mistress had spoken to her with pleasure in her good fortune. About Sophie no one felt any anxiety. Chapter 3 of the Gifts of the Child Christ by George Macdonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. On the Sunday evening, Alice's lover, having heard not from herself, but by a side wind, that she was going home the next day, made his appearance in Wimborne Square, somewhat perplexed, both at the move and at her leaving him in ignorance of the same. He was a cabinet maker in an honest shop in the neighbourhood, and in education, faculty, and general worth considerably Alice's superior, a fact that hitherto rather pleased her, but now gave zest to the change which she imagined had subverted her former relation. Full of the sense of her new superiority, she had him draped in an indescribable strangeness. John Jephson felt, at the very first word, as if her voice came from the other side of the English Channel. He wondered what he had done, or rather, what Alice could imagine he had done or said, to put her in such tantrums. "Alice, dear," he said, for John was a man to go straight at the enemy, "what's amiss? What's come over you? You ain't altogether like your own self to-night. And here I find you're going away, and ne'er a word to me about it. What have I done?" Alice's chin alone made reply. She waited the fitting moment, with splendour to astonish, and with grandeur to subdue her lover. To tell the sad truth, she was no longer sure that it would be well to encourage him on the old footing. Was she not standing on tiptoe, her skirts in one hand, on the brink of the brook that parted serfdom from gentility, on the point of stepping daintily across, and leaving domestic slavery, red hands, caps, and obedience behind her? How then was she to marry a man that had black nails, and smelt of glue? It was incumbent on her, at least, for propriety's sake, to render him at once aware that it was in condescension ineffable she took any notice of him. "Alice, my girl," began John again, in expostulatory tone. "Miss Cox, if you please, John Jephson," interposed Alice. "What on earth's come over you?" exclaimed John, with the first throb of rousing indignation. "But if you ain't your own self no more, why, Miss Cox be it. It seems to me as if I weren't my own self no more, 's if I'd got into something else, or at least hadn't got my own ears on me own head. Never saw or heerd Alice like this afore," he added, turning in gloomy bewilderment to the housemaid for a word of human sympathy. The movement did not altogether please Alice, and she felt she must justify her behaviour. "You see, John," she said with dignity, keeping her back towards him and pretending to dust the globe of a lamp, "there's things as no woman can help, and therefore as no man has no right to complain of them. It's not as if I'd gone and done it, or changed myself, no more'n if I had took place in my cradle. What can I help it if the world goes and changes itself? Am I to blame? Tell me that. It's not that. I make no complaint. But I tell you it ain't me. It's circumstances as gone and changed theirselves, and being as circumstances is changed, things ain't the same as they was, and miss is the properer term for you to me, John Jephson." Dang it if I know what you're driving at, Alice. Miss Cox. I beg your pardon, miss. I'm sure. Dang me if I do. Don't swear, John Jephson, leastways before a lady. It's not proper. It seems to me, Miss Cox, as if the wind was a-settin' from Bedlam, or maybe Colney Hatch, said John, who was considered a humorist among his comrades. I wouldn't take no liberties with a lady, Miss Cox, but if I might be so bold as to arst the joke of the thing? Joke indeed, cried Alice. Do you call a dead uncle and £10,000 a joke? God bless me, said John. You don't mean it, Alice. I do mean it, and that you'll find, John Jephson. I'm going to bid you good-bye to-morrer. Hoy, Alice! exclaimed honest John, aghast. It's truth I tell ye, said Alice. And for how long? gasped John, for feeling illimitable misfortune. That depends, returned Alice, who did not care to lessen the effect of her communication by mentioning her promised return for a season. It ain't likely, she added, as an heiress is gonna to act the nussmaid much longer. But Alice, said John, you don't mean to say, it's not in your mind now. It can't be, Alice. You're only joking with me. Indeed I am not, interjected Alice with a sniff. I don't mean it that way, you know. What I mean is, you don't mean as how this 'ere money, dang it all, as how is to be all over between you and me? You can't mean that, Alice, ended the poor fellow, with a choking in his throat. It was very hard upon him. He must look either as if he wanted to share her money, or else as if he were ready to give her up. Arst yourself, John Jephson, answered Alice, whether it's likely a young lady of fortune would be keeping company with a young man as didn't know how to take off his hat to her in the park. Alice did not above half mean what she said. She wished mainly to enhance her own importance. At the same time she did mean it half, and that would have been enough for Jephson. He rose, grievously wounded. Good-bye, Alice, taking the hand she did not refuse. You're throwing from ye what all your money won't buy. She gave a scornful little laugh, and John walked out of the kitchen. At the door he turned with one lingering look, but in Alice there was no sign of softening. She turned scornfully away, and no doubt Chapter 4 of The Gifts of the Child Christ by George Macdonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Mr. Greatorex had ceased to regard the advent of Christmas with much interest. Naturally gifted with a strong religious tendency, he had, since his first marriage, taken, not to denial, but to the side of objection, spending much energy in contempt for the foolish opinions of others, a self-indulgence which does less than little to further the growth of one's own spirit in truth and righteousness. The only person who stands excused, I do not say justified, in doing so is the man who, having been taught the same opinions, has found them a legion of adversaries barring his way to the truth. But having got rid of them himself, it is, I suspect, worse than useless to attack them again, save as the ally of those who are fighting their way through the same ranks to the truth. Greatorex had been indulging his intellect at the expense of his heart. A man may have light in the brain and darkness in the heart. It were better to be an owl than a strong-eyed apteryx. He was on the path which naturally ends in blindness and unbelief. I fancy, if he had not been neglectful of his child, she would ere this time have relighted his Christmas candles for him, but now his second disappointment in marriage had so dulled his heart that he had begun to regard life as a stupid affair, in which the most enviable fool was the man who could still expect to realize an ideal. he set out on a false track altogether, but had not yet discovered that there had been an immoral element at work in his mistake. For what right had he to desire the fashioning of any woman after his ideas? Did not the angel of her eternal ideal forever behold the face of her Father in heaven? The best that can be said for him is, that notwithstanding his disappointment and her faults, yea, notwithstanding his own faults, which were, with all his cultivation and strength of character, yet more serious than hers, he was still kind to her. Yes, I may say for him that, notwithstanding even her silliness, which is a sickening fault, and one which no supremacy of beauty can overshadow, he still loved her a little. Hence the care he showed for her in respect of the coming sorrow was genuine. It did not all belong to his desire for a son to whom he might be a father indeed, after his own fancies, however. Letty, on her part, was as full of expectation as the girl who has been promised a doll that can shut and open its eyes, and cry when it is pinched. Her carelessness of its safe arrival came of ignorance and not indifference. It cannot but seem strange that such a man should have been so careless of the child he had, but from the first she had painfully reminded him of her mother, with whom, in truth, he had never quarreled, but with whom he had not found life the less irksome on that account. Add to this he had been growing fonder of business, a fact which indicated, in a man of his endowment and development, an inclination downwards of the plane of his life. It was some time since he had given up reading poetry. History had almost followed. He now read little except politics, travels, and popular expositions of scientific progress. That year Christmas Eve fell upon a Monday. The day before, Letty was not feeling very well. Her husband thought it better not to leave her, and gave up going to church. Phoebe was utterly forgotten, but she dressed herself, and at the usual hour appeared with her prayer book in her hand, ready for church. When her father told her that he was not going, she looked so blank that he took pity upon her, and accompanied her to the church door, promising to meet her as she came out. Phoebe sighed with relief as she entered, for she had a vague idea that by going to church to pray for it, she might move the Lord to chasten her. At least he would see her there, and might think of it. She had never had such an attention from her father before, never such dignity conferred upon her as to be allowed to appear in church alone, sitting in the pew by herself like a grown damsel. But I doubt if there was any pride in her stately step, or any vanity in the smile. No, not smile, but illuminated mist, the vapor of smiles, which haunted her sweet little solemn church window of a face, as she walked up the aisle. The preacher was one of whom she had never heard her father speak slighting word, in whom her unbounded trust had never been shaken. Also he was one who believed with his whole soul in the things that make Christmas precious. To him the birth of the wonderful baby hinted at hundreds of strange things in the economy of the planet. That a man could so thoroughly persuade himself that he believed the old fable was matter of marvel to some of his friends, who held blind Nature the eternal mother, and Night the everlasting grandmother of all things. But the child Phoebe, in her dreams or out of them, in church or nursery, with her book or her doll, was never out of the region of wonders, and would have believed, or tried to believe, anything that did not involve a moral impossibility. What the preacher said I need not even partially repeat. It is enough to mention a certain metamorphose deposited from the stream of his eloquence, carried home in her mind by Phoebe. From some of his sayings about the birth of Jesus into the world, into the family, into the individual human bosom, she had got it into her head that Christmas Day was not a birthday like that she had herself last year, but that, in some wonderful way, to her requiring no explanation, the baby Jesus was born every Christmas Day afresh. What became of him afterwards she did not know, and indeed she had never yet thought to ask how it was that he could come to every house in London as well as No. 1 Wimborne Square. Little of a home as another might think it, that house was yet to her the centre of all houses, and the wonder had not yet widened, rippling beyond it. Into the spot of the pool the eternal gift would fall. Her father forgot the time over his book, but so entranced was her heart with the expectation of the promised visit, now so near, the day after tomorrow, that, if she did not altogether forget to look for him as she stepped down the stair from the church door to the street, his absence caused her no uneasiness, and when, just as she reached it, he opened the house door in tardy haste to redeem his promise, she looked up at him with a solemn, smileless repose, born of spiritual tension and speechless anticipation, upon her face, and walking past him without change in the rhythm of her motion, marched stately up the stairs to the nursery. I believe the centre of her hope was that when the baby came she would beg him on her knees to ask the Lord to chasten her. When dessert was over, her mother on the sofa in the drawing-room, and her father in an easy-chair, with a bottle of his favourite wine by his side, she crept out of the room and away again to the nursery. There she reached up to her little bookshelf, and, full of the sermon as spongy mists are full of the sunlight, took thence a volume of stories from the German, the re-reading of one of which, narrating the visit of the Christ child laden with gifts to a certain household, and what he gave to each and all therein, she had, although sorely tempted, saved up until now, and sat down with it by the fire, the only light she had. When the housemaid, suddenly remembering she must put her to bed, and at the same time discovering it was a full hour past her usual time, hurried to the nursery, she found her fast asleep in her little armchair, her book on her lap, and the fire self-consumed into a dark cave with a sombre glow in its deepest hollows. Dreams had doubtless come to deepen the impressions of sermon and Marken, for as she slowly yielded to the hands of Polly, putting her to bed, her lips, unconsciously moved of the slumbering but not sleeping spirit, more than once murmured the words, "Lord loveth," and "chasteneth." Right blessedly would I enter the dreams of such a child. Chapter 5 of The Gifts of the Child Christ by George Macdonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. On Christmas Eve the church bells were ringing through the murky air of London, whose streets lay flaring and steaming below. The brightest of their constellations were the butchers' shops, with their shows of prize beef. Around them, the eddies of the human tides were most confused and knotted. But the toy shops were brilliant also. To Phosy they would have been the treasure caves of the Christ child, all mysteries, all with insides to them, boxes and desks and windmills and dovecots and hens with chickens, and who could tell what all? In every one of those shops her eyes would have searched for the Christ child, the giver of all their wealth, for to her he was everywhere that night, ubiquitous as the luminous mist that brooded over London, of which, however, she saw nothing but the glow above the Mews. John Jephson was out in the middle of all the show, drifting about in it. He saw nothing that had pleasure in it, his heart was so heavy. He never thought once of the Christ child, or even of the Christ man, as the giver of anything. Birth is the one standing promise, hope for the race, but for poor John this Christmas held no promise. With all his humor, he was one of those people, generally dull and slow. God grant me and mine such dullness and such sloth, who having once loved cannot cease. During the fortnight he had scarce had a moment's ease from the sting of Alice's treatment. The honest fellow's feelings were no study to himself. He knew nothing but the pleasure and the pain of them, but I believe it was not mainly for himself that he was sorry. Like Othello, the pity of it haunted him. He had taken Alice for a downright girl, about whom there was and could be no mistake, and the first hot blast of prosperity had swept her away like a hectic leaf. What were all the shops dressed out in holly and mistletoe? What were all the rushing, flaming gas jets? What the fattest of prize pigs to John, who could never more imagine a spare rib on the table between Alice and him of a Sunday? His imagination ran on, seeing her pass in her carriage, and drop him a nod of condescension as she swept noisily by him, trudging home weary from his work to his loveless fireside. He didn't want her money. Honestly, he would rather have her without than with money, for he now regarded it as an enemy, seeing what evil changes it could work. "There be some devil in it, sure," he said to himself. True, he had never found any in his week's wages, but he did remember once finding the devil in a month's wages, received in a lump. As he was thus thinking with himself, a carriage came suddenly from a side street into the crowd, and while he stared at it, thinking Alice might be sitting inside it while he was tramping the pavement alone, she passed him on the other side on foot, was actually pushed against him. He looked round and saw a young woman, carrying a small bag, disappearing in the crowd. "There's an air of Alice about her," said John to himself, seeing her back only. But of course it couldn't be Alice. For her he must look in the carriages now. And what a fool he was! Every young woman reminded him of the one he had lost. Perhaps if he was to call the next day, Polly was a good-natured creature, he might hear some news of her. It had been a troubled fortnight with Mrs. Greatorex. She wished much that she could talk with her husband more freely, but she had not learned to feel at home with him. Yet he had been kinder and more attentive than usual all the time, so much so that Letty thought with herself, if she gave him a boy, he would certainly return to his first devotion. She said boy, because anyone might see he cared little for Phosy. She had never discovered that he was disappointed in herself, but, since her disregard of his wishes had brought evil upon her, she had begun to suspect that he had some ground for being dissatisfied with her. She never dreamed of his kindness as the effort of a conscientious nature to make the best of what could not now be otherwise helped. Her own poverty of spirit and lack of worth achieved, she knew as little of as she did of the riches of Michael the Archangel. One must have begun to gather wisdom before he can see his own folly. That evening she was seated alone in the drawing-room, her husband having left her to smoke his cigar, when the butler entered and informed her that Alice had returned, but was behaving so oddly that they did not know what to do with her. Asking wherein her oddness consisted, and learning that it was mostly in silence and tears, she was not sorry to gather that some disappointment had befallen her, and felt considerable curiosity to know what it was. She therefore told him to send her upstairs. Meantime Polly, the housemaid, seeing plainly enough from her return in the middle of her holiday, and from her utter dejection, that Alice's expectations had been frustrated, and cherishing no little resentment against her because of her uppishness on the first news of her good fortune, had been ungenerous enough to take her revenge in a way as stinging in effect as bitter in intention, for she loudly protested that no amount of such luck as she pretended to suppose in Alice's possession would have induced her to behave herself so that a handsome honest fellow like John Jephson should be driven to despise her and take up with her betters. When her mistress's message came, Alice was only too glad to find refuge from the kitchen in the drawing-room. The moment she entered, she fell on her knees at the foot of the couch on which her mistress lay, covered her face with her hands, and sobbed grievously. Nor was the change more remarkable in her bearing than in her person. She was pale and worn, and had a hunted look, was in fact a mere shadow of what she had been. For a time her mistress found it impossible to quiet her so as to draw from her her story. Tears and sob combined with repugnance to hold her silent. "Oh, ma'am," she burst out at length, wringing her hands, "how ever can I tell you? You will never speak to me again. Little did I think such a disgrace was waiting me." "It was no fault of yours if you were misinformed," said her mistress, "or that your uncle was not the rich man you fancied." "Oh, ma'am, there was no mistake there. He was more than twice as rich as I fancied. If he had only died a beggar and left things as they was." "Then he didn't leave it to his nephews and nieces as they told you? Well, there's no disgrace in that." "Oh, but he did, ma'am. That was all right. No mistake there either, ma'am. And to think of me misbehaving as I did. To you and master as was so good to me. Who will ever take any more notice of me now, after what has come out, as I'm sure I no more dreamed on than the child unborn?" An agonized burst of fresh weeping followed, and it was with prolonged difficulty, and by incessant questioning, that Mrs. Greatorex at length drew from her the following facts. Before Alice and her brother could receive the legacy to which they laid claim, it was necessary to produce certain documents, the absence of which, as of any proof to take their place, led to the unavoidable publication of a fact previously known only to a living few, namely, that the father and mother of Alice Hopwood had never been married, which fact deprived them of the smallest claim on the legacy, and fell like a millstone upon Alice and her pride. From the height of her miserable arrogance she fell prone, not merely hurled back into the lowly condition from which she had raised her head only to despise it with base unrighteousness, and to adopt and reassert the principles she had abhorred when they affected herself. Not merely this, but, in her own judgment at least, no longer the respectable member of society she had hitherto been justified in supposing herself. The relation of her father and mother she felt overshadowed her with a disgrace unfathomable, the more overwhelming that it cast her from the gates of the paradise she had seemed on the point of entering. Her fall she measured by the height of the social ambition she had cherished, and had seemed on the point of attaining. But it is not an evil that the devil's money, which this legacy had from the first proved to Alice, should turn to a hot cinder in the hand. Rarely had a more haughty spirit than hers gone before a fall, and rarely has the fall been more sudden and more abject. And the consciousness of the behaviour into which her false riches had seduced her, changed the whip of her chastisement into scorpions. Worst of all, she had insulted her lover as beneath her notice, and the next moment had found herself too vile for his. Judging by herself in the injustice of bitter humiliation, she imagined him scoffing with his mates at the base-born menial who had set up for a fine lady. But had she been more worthy of honest John, she would have understood him better. As it was, no really good fortune could have befallen her, but such as now seemed to her the depth of evil fortune. Without humiliation to prepare the way for humility, she must have become capable of more and more baseness, until she lost all that makes life worth having. When Mrs. Greatorex had given her what consolation she found handy, and at length dismissed her, the girl, unable to endure her own company, sought the nursery, where she caught Sophie in her arms and embraced her with fervour. Never in her life having been the object of such display of feeling, Phosy was much astonished. When Alice had set her down, and she had resumed her seat by the fireside, she went on staring for a while, and then a strange sort of miming ensued. It was Phosy's habit, one less rare with children than may by most be imagined, to do what she could to enter into any state of mind whose shows were sufficiently marked for her observation. She sought to lay hold of the feeling that produced the expression, less than the reproduction of a similar condition in her own imaginative sensorium, subject to her leisurely examination, would in no case satisfy the little metaphysician. But what was indeed very odd was the means she took for arriving at the sympathetic knowledge she desired. As if she had been the most earnest student of dramatic expression through the facial muscles, she would sit watching the countenance of the object of her solicitude, all the time, with full consciousness, fashioning her own as nearly as she could into the lines and forms of the other. In proportion as she succeeded, the little psychologist imagined she felt in herself the condition that produced the phenomenon she observed, as if the shape of her face cast inward its shadow upon her mind, and so revealed to it, through the two faces, what was moving and shaping in the mind of the other. In the present instance, having at length, after modeling and remodeling her face like that of a gutta percha doll for some time, composed it finally into the best correspondence she could effect, she sat brooding for a while, with Alice's expression as it were frozen upon it. Gradually the forms assumed melted away, and allowed her still solemn face to look out from behind them. The moment this evanishment was complete, she rose and went to Alice, where she sat staring into the fire, unconscious of the scrutiny she had been undergoing, and, looking up in her face, took her thumb out of her mouth and said, "Is the Lord chastening Alice? I wish he would chasten Phosy." Her face was calm as that of the Sphinx. There was no mist in the depth of her gray eyes, not a cloud on the wide heaven of her forehead. Was the child crazed? What could the atom mean, with her big eyes looking right into her? Alice never had understood her. It was indeed strange, if the less should comprehend the greater. She was not yet capable of recognizing the word of the Lord in the mouth of babes and sucklings, but there was something in Phosy's face besides its calmness and unintelligibility. What it was, Alice could never have told, yet it did her good. She lifted the child on her lap. There she soon fell asleep. Alice undressed her, laid her in her crib, and went to bed herself. But, weary as she was, she had to rise again before she got to sleep. Her mistress was again taken ill. Doctor and nurse were sent for in hot haste. Hansom cabs came and went throughout the night, like noisy moths, to the one lighted house in the street. There were soft steps within, and doors were gently opened and shut. The waters of Mara had risen and filled the house. Towards morning they were ebbing slowly away. Letty did not know that her husband was watching by her bedside. The street was quiet now. So was the house. Most of its people had been up throughout the night, but now they had all gone to bed, except the strange nurse and Mr. Greatorex. It was the morning of Christmas Day, and little Phosy knew it in every cranny of her soul. She was not of those who had been up all night, and now she was awake, early and wide, and the moment she awoke she was speculating. He was coming to-day. How would he come? Where should she find the baby Jesus? And when would he come? In the morning, in the afternoon, or in the evening? Could such a grief be in store for her as that he would not appear until night, when she would be again in bed? But she would not sleep till all hope was gone. Would everybody be gathered to meet him, or would he show himself to one after another, each alone? Then her turn would be last, and oh, if he could come to the nursery! But perhaps he would not appear to her at all, for was she not one whom the Lord did not care to chasten? Expectation grew and wrought in her until she could lay in bed no longer. Alice was fast asleep. It must be early, but whether it was yet light or not she could not tell for the curtains. Anyhow, she would get up and dress, and then she would be ready for Jesus whenever he should come. True, she was not able to dress herself very well, but he would know, and would not mind. She made all the haste she could, consistently with taking pains, and was soon attired after a fashion. She crept out of the room and down the stair. The house was very still. What if Jesus should come and find nobody awake? Would he go again and give them no presents? She couldn't expect any herself, but might he not let her take theirs for the rest? Perhaps she ought to wake them all, but she dared not without being sure. On the last landing above the first floor, she saw, by the low gaslight at the end of the corridor, an unknown figure pass the foot of the stair. Could she have anything to do with the marvel of the day? The woman looked up, and Phosy dropped the question. Yet she might be a charwoman, whose assistance the expected advent rendered necessary. When she reached the bottom of the stair, she saw her disappearing in her stepmother's room. That she did not like. It was the one room into which she could not go, but as the house was so still, she would search everywhere else, and if she did not find him, would sit down in the hall and wait for him. The room next the foot of the stair, and opposite her stepmother's, was the spare room, with which she associated ideas of state and grandeur. Where better could she begin than at the guest chamber? There? Could it be? Yes! Through the chink of the scarce closed door she saw light. Either he was already there, or there they were expecting him. From that moment she felt as if lifted out of the body. Far exalted above all dread, she peeped modestly in, and then entered. Beyond the foot of the bed, a candle stood on a little low table, but nobody was to be seen. There was a stool near the table. She would sit on it by the candle, and wait for him. But ere she reached it, she caught sight of something upon the bed that drew her thither. She stood entranced. Could it be? It might be. Perhaps he had left it there while he went into her mamma's room with something for her, the loveliest of dolls ever imagined. She drew nearer. The light was low, and the shadows were many. She could not be sure what it was, but when she had gone close up to it, she concluded with certainty that it was in very truth a doll, perhaps intended for her, but beyond doubt the most exquisite of dolls. She dragged a chair to the bed, got up, pushed her little arms softly under it, and drawing it gently to her, slid down with it. When she felt her feet firm on the floor, filled with the solemn composure of holy awe, she carried the gift of the child Jesus to the candle, that she might the better admire its beauty and know its preciousness. But the light had no sooner fallen upon it than a strange undefinable doubt awoke within her. Whatever it was the very essence of loveliness. The little darling with its alabaster face, and its delicately modelled hands and fingers! A long nightgown covered all the rest. Was it possible? Could it be? Yes, indeed, it must be. It could be nothing else than a real baby. What a goose she had been! Of course it was baby Jesus himself, for was not this his very own Christmas Day on which he was always born? If she had felt awe of his gift before, what a grandeur of adoring love, what a divine dignity possessed her, holding in her arms the very child himself! One shudder of bliss passed through her, and in an agony of possession she clasped the baby to her great heart, then at once became still with the satisfaction of eternity, with the peace of God. She sat down on the stool, near the little table, with her back to the candle, that its rays should not fall on the eyes of the sleeping Jesus, and wake him. There she sat, lost in the very majesty of bliss, at once the mother and the slave of the Lord Jesus. She sat for a time still as marble, waiting for marble to awake, heedful as tenderest woman not to rouse him before his time, though her heart was swelling with the eager petition that he would ask his Father to be as good as chasten her. And as she sat, she began, after her wont, to model her face to the likeness of his, that she might understand his stillness, the absolute peace that dwelt on his countenance. But as she did so, again a sudden doubt invaded her. Jesus lay so very still, never moved, never opened his pale eyelids. And now set thinking, she noted that he did not breathe. She had seen babies asleep, and their breath came and went. Their little bosoms heaved up and down, and sometimes they would smile, and sometimes they would moan and sigh. But Jesus did none of these things. Was it not strange? And then he was cold, oh, so cold! A blue silk coverlid lay on the bed. She half rose and dragged it off, and contrived to wind it around herself and the baby. Sad at heart, Chapter 6 of the Gifts of the Child Christ by George Macdonald. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Meantime, the morning of Christmas Day grew. The light came and filled the house. The sleepers slept late, but at length they stirred. Alice woke last, from a troubled sleep, in which the events of the night mingled with her own lost condition and destiny. After all, Polly had been kind, she thought, and got Sophie up without disturbing her. She had been but a few minutes down, when a strange and appalling rumour made itself, I cannot say audible, but somehow known through the house, and everyone hurried up in horrible dismay. The nurse had gone into the spare room, and missed the little dead thing she had laid there. The bed was between her and Phosy, and she never saw her. The doctor had been sharp with her about something the night before. She now took her revenge in suspicion of him, and after a hasty and fruitless visit of inquiry to the kitchen, hurried to Mr. Greatorex's. The servants crowded to the spare room, and when their master, incredulous indeed, yet shocked at the tidings brought him, hastened to the spot, he found them all in the room, gathered at the foot of the bed. A little sunlight filtered through the red window curtains, and gave a strange pallid expression to the flame of the candle, which had now burned very low. At first he saw nothing but the group of servants, silent, motionless, with their heads leaning forward, intently gazing. He had come just in time. Another moment and they would have ruined the lovely sight. He stepped forward and saw Phosy, half shrouded in blue, the candle behind illuminating the hair she had found too rebellious to brush, and making of it a faint aureole about her head and white face, whence cold and sorrow had driven all the flush, rendering it colourless as that upon her arm which had never seen the light. She had pored on the little face until she knew death, and now she sat a speechless mother of sorrow, bending in the dim light of the tomb over the body of her holy infant. How it was I cannot tell, but the moment her father saw her she looked up, and the spell of her dumbness broke. "Jesus is dead," she said slowly and sadly, but with perfect calmness. "He is dead," she repeated. "He came too early, and there was no one up to take care of him, and he's dead. Dead, dead." But as she spoke the last words, the frozen lump of agony gave way. The well of her heart suddenly filled, swelled, overflowed. The last word was half sob, half shriek of utter despair and loss. Alice darted forward and took the dead baby tenderly from her. The same moment her father raised the little mother and clasped her to his bosom. Her arms went round his neck, her head sank on his shoulder, and sobbing in grievous misery, yet already a little comforted, he bore her from the room. "No, no, Phosy," they heard him say. "Jesus is not dead, thank God. It is only your little brother that hadn't life enough, and is gone back to God for more." Weeping, the women went down the stairs. Alice's tears were still flowing, when John Jephson entered. Her own troubles forgotten in the emotion of the scene she had just witnessed, she ran to his arms and wept on his bosom. John stood as one astonished. "Oh, Lord, this is Christmas!" he sighed at last. "Oh, John!" cried Alice, and tore herself from his embrace. "I forgot! You'll never speak to me again, John! Don't do it, John!" And with the words she gave a stifled cry, and fell a weeping again. behind her two shrieking hands. "Why, Alice, you ain't married, are you?" gasped John, to whom that was the only possible evil. "No, John, and shall never be. A respectable man like you would never think of looking twice on a poor girl like me." "Let's have one more look anyhow," said John, drawing her hands from her face. "Tell me what's the matter, and if there's anything can be done to right you, I'll work day and night to do it, Alice." "There's nothing can be done, John," replied Alice, and would again have floated out on the ocean of her misery, but in spite of wind and tide, that is sobs and tears, she held on by the shore at his entreaty, and told her tale, not even omitting the fact that when she went to the eldest of the cousins, inheriting through the misfortune of her and her brother so much more than their expected share, and demeaned herself to beg a little help for her brother, who was dying of consumption, he had all but ordered her out of the house, swearing he had nothing to do with her or her brother, and saying she ought to be ashamed to show her face. "And that when we used to make mud pies together," concluded Alice with indignation. "There, John, you have it all," she added. "And now?" With the word she gave a deep, humbling, questioning look into his honest eyes. "Is that all, Alice?" he asked. "Yes, John, ain't it enough?" she returned. "More'n enough," answered John. "I swear to you, Alice, you're worth to me 10 times what you would have been, even if you'd had me, with 10,000 pounds in ridicule. Why, my woman, I never saw you look 1/2 as 'andsome as you do now." "But the disgrace of it, John," said Alice, hanging her head, and so hiding the pleasure that would dawn through all the mist of her misery. "Let your father and mother settle that betwixt them, Alice. 'Tain't none o' my business. Please God, we'll do different. When shall it be, my girl?" "When you like, John," answered Alice, without raising her head thoughtfully. When she had withdrawn herself from the too rigorous embrace with which he received her consent, she remarked, "I do believe, John, money ain't a good thing. Sure as I live, with the very wind of that money the devil entered into me. Don't you hate me, John? Speak the truth now." "No, Alice, I did cry a bit over you, though. You was possessed like." "I was possessed. I do believe if that money hadn't been took from me, I'd never have had you, John. Ain't it awful to think on?" "Well, no. O' course, how could ye?" said Jephson, with reluctance. "Now, John, don't ye talk like that, for I won't stand for it. Don't you go for to set me up again with excusing of me. I'm a nasty conceited cat, I am, and all for nothing but mean pride." "Mind ye, ye're mine now, Alice, and what's mine's mine, and I won't have it abused. I knows you twice the woman you was afore, and all the world couldn't get me such another Christmas box. No, not if it was all gold watches and roast beef." When Mr. Greatorex returned to his wife's room, and thought to find her asleep as he left her, he was dismayed to hear sounds of soft weeping from the bed. Some tone or stray word, never intended to reach her ear, had been enough to reveal the truth concerning her baby. "Hush, hush," he said, with more love in his heart than had moved there for many months, and therefore more in his tone than she had heard for as many. "If you cry you will be ill. Hush, my dear." In a moment, ere he could prevent her, she had flung her arms around his neck as he stooped over her. "Husband, husband," she cried, "is it my fault?" "You behaved perfectly," he returned. "No woman could have been braver." "Ah, but I wouldn't stay at home when you wanted me." "Never mind that now, my child," he said. At the word she pulled his face down to hers. "I have you, and I don't care," he added. "Do you care to have me?" she said, with a sob that ended in a loud cry. "Oh, I don't deserve it, but I will be good after this. I promise you I will." Then you must begin now, my darling. You must lie perfectly still and not cry a bit, or you will go after the baby and I shall be left alone." She looked up at him with such a light in her face as he had never dreamed of there before. He had never seen her so lovely. Then she withdrew her arms, repressed her tears, smiled, and turned her face away. He put her hands Chapter 7 of the Gifts of the Child Christ by George Macdonald. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. That day, when Phosy and her father had sat down to their Christmas dinner, he rose again, and taking her up as she sat, chair and all, set her down close to him, on the other side of the corner of the table. It was the first of a new covenant between them. The father's eyes having been suddenly opened to her character and preciousness, as well as to his own neglected duty in regard to her, it was as if a well of life had burst forth at his feet. And every day, as he looked in her face and talked to her, it was with more and more respect for what he found in her, with growing tenderness for her predilections, and reverence for the divine idea enclosed in her ignorance, for her childish wisdom and her calm seeking, until at length he would have been horrified at the thought of training her up in his way. Had she not a way of her own to go, following, not the dead Jesus, but him who liveth for evermore? In the endeavor to help her, he had to find his own position towards the truth, and the results were weighty. Nor did the child's influence work forward merely. In his intercourse with her, he was so often reminded of his first wife, and that with the gloss or comment of a childish reproduction, that his memories of her at length grew a little tender, and through the child he began to understand the nature and worth of the mother. In her child she had given him what she could not be herself. Unable to keep up with him, she had handed him her baby and dropped on the path. Nor was little Sophie his only comfort. Through their common loss and her husband's tenderness, Letty began to grow a woman, and her growth was the more rapid that, himself taught through Phosy, her husband no longer desired to make her adopt his tastes, and judge with his experiences, but, as became the elder and the tried, entered into her tastes and experiences, became, as it were, a child again with her, that through the thing she was, he might help the thing she had to be. As soon as she was able to bear it, he told her the story of the dead Jesus, and with the tale came her heart love for Phosy. She had lost a son for a season, but she had gained a daughter forever. Such were the gifts the Christ child brought to one household that Christmas, and the days of the mourning of that household